Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. This is Melissa Bauer. I am the Member Sustainability Manager at the Pet Sustainability Coalition. And thank you so much for joining us for this very important conversation about sustainable proteins within the pet industry. We've got a really full house today, so I'm going to give us just a minute or two to allow more people to log on, but we'll be right back. And once again, thanks for joining us. So good morning again. Once again, this is Melissa Bauer. I am the Member Sustainability Manager at the Pet Sustainability Coalition, and we're so excited to have you join us for our really important conversation this morning on sustainable proteins within the pet industry. We've got a lot that we're going to cover today, so we'll dive in just a few minutes. But before that, just a few things on housekeeping. First of all, everybody that is joining us today will be getting a copy of the recording of our time spent together today, and also a copy of the slides that we'll be going through. Second of all, we're going to allow plenty of time at the end of this presentation for questions and answers. You do have a chat box and a question chat available to you. So I will be monitoring that over the course of our call, and then we'll make sure that we get as many of those questions that we can at the end. Finally, we do have a PSC member-only session directly after this webinar. In that member session only, we are going to be talking about next steps and how PSC members can be active in the implementation and next steps of this program. So if you are a PSC member, we would be delighted to have you join us for that conversation. If you are not a PSC member, why not? But you are interested in learning more about membership, please don't hesitate to get in touch with myself, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that. That members only session will be under a separate GoToWebinar link that you should already be registered for if you're going to be joining us. But if you are a PSC member and aren't registered for that second session, just drop me an email and we'll get you registered quickly. So diving right in. As I mentioned, we are the Pet Sustainability Coalition. We are a industry organization made up of over 100 different pet companies spanning the supply chain, everyone from distributors and suppliers to brands in the hard goods and consumable space all over the world. We interact with our members in many different ways, but this slide highlights how we do that in kind of the three top areas. We provide an online toolkit with dozens of resources. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, I highly suggest everything from building efficiency guides to templates on how to create a green team. Those tools and resources are available to not just PSC members, but the industry as a whole as part of our online toolkit. We also provide this monthly webinar series and tons of different education opportunities. We serve as a source of inspiration and collaboration throughout the pet industry. We have several events a year bringing members and pet industry professionals together to build a network of influential and active leaders working towards a more sustainable pet industry. And then we also help to serve our members take action and advance their environmental and social strategy to drive business value. However, something that doesn't get talked about as much is how PSC exists outside of the membership model. And that's really what our webinar today will be focused on. We really try to serve as a hub for research that will benefit the entire pet industry as a whole. We've done that in several different ways. We did a packaging webinar earlier this year that talked about that research program, but today we're going to really focus on a research program that we've been working on for a great deal of time, talking about the relationship between nutrition and environmental impact for different common protein types used in the pet food and treat industry. So to go over this really important research, I'm going to be handing things over to Nick Sterling. Nick has been an integral partner with PSC since our beginning in 2013 and has really helped lead this research for us. So I will hand things over to you, Nick. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Melissa. All right. Let's go ahead and switch screens here. And Melissa, can you let me know, are you guys seeing the first slide?
We can see you, yeah.
Awesome. So getting started, what I'm looking to kind of walk us through today in our discussion about sustainable proteins are really 4 key sustainability areas. So as Melissa mentioned, the environment is a big piece there. Social impacts, animal welfare, and then certainly nutrition. So we'll walk through each of the 4 of these, and then, please, as we're going through this presentation, if you have questions, feel free to use that chat function. Melissa will be sort of collecting all of those, and then we can address them at the end, and we will certainly carve out a bit of time for Q&A there. So starting to look at the environment. I think this is something that, by and large, tends to get the most coverage, definitely within the pet industry, but also within just about any other, agricultural commodity. And it's something that, the conversation that happens around it can be certainly polarized, particularly if you're just reading the headlines. These are just sort of 3 examples that were readily available. But, there's a number of other ones that could easily be on here. But looking at how all of this starts to sort of tee up, there is some concern from the standpoint of what is the environmental impact when it comes to our pets, and particularly with pet food. And so this was something that Jason Clay from World Wildlife Foundation had talked about previously. But essentially, the synopsis here is that there's a large impact that pets have from the food that they are consuming. Now, it's not to say that that impact is on it in and of itself necessarily bad, but essentially it's operating within a current food production system that is broken. Our distribution of calories and nutrients is incredibly imbalanced globally, and there's limitations and failures with our current food system that raises not just sustainability concerns, but also moral and ethical ones. And so this is the reality we're all operating in when it comes to producing, distributing, and consuming pet food. And it's an important consideration as we look at how we might be able to go forward, particularly with the challenge of not necessarily just how do we improve the sustainability of our protein sourcing for pet food, but how do we improve the overall sustainability of our food production system? So to help guide some of this, we engaged with Iowa State University, which they started to, do some research into both the environmental and nutritional attributes around protein sourcing. So looking at kind of whole meat products or human grade proteins, as well as byproducts across 5 different species. And what they were really looking at there with the variables related to protein sourcing for nutrition and environmental impact with these 5 species is they were looking at what is the relative contribution that each of these different types of protein is contributing to that overall environmental impact. And so for the environmental side, what they looked at is sort of what's referred to as farm to gate. So essentially, these are the production practices on farm for where these animals are being raised up to the point of distribution. So it's not taking into account necessarily shipping miles or transportation or actual sort of manufacturing or production practices. What it's really focusing on is the life cycle impact of that animal, looking at both sort of the impact of the animal itself, but then also what are the inputs required to bring that animal to, say, a market weight from a standpoint of feed or other inputs that it's receiving. The study really looked at sort of USDA data as to the relative breakdown of meat, byproducts, and bone. What they were really looking to do is sort of based off of sort of the 4 functional units is really be able to get a sense of what is the relative contribution for each of these sort of meat byproducts from a standpoint of environmental impact as well as nutritional contribution. And what they looked at for the offal was essentially a number of different items, not including bone meal, but there's sort of, this being a literature review or a study of studies, there's a number of different studies that they pulled that they had to work to aggregate and summarize. And so some of those were, including some of the things like bone meal, others weren't. And so they had to work to kind of make them a little bit more of an apples to apples comparison. So there was some work that was done on their side to manage that data, but by and large, they focused on sort of those 4 functional units for each of those 5 species we looked at previously. So walking through at a high level the initial impacts on the environmental side, this is sort of greenhouse gas impact, and the light shading there is essentially the human grade meat products. So this would be, your cut of beef you're putting on your barbecue, whereas the darker shade there is going to be the byproducts. And so what this shows is sort of the range as far as what the studies had seen and that the ISU researchers profiled as to the relative contribution for each of these species by meat and or byproducts for the light shading or dark shading for each of the 5 species. So as you can see, no surprise that beef cattle are the largest impact. It's something that, I think most folks are pretty familiar with, but you can see sort of other ruminants such as sheep are quite high, with poultry being one of the lowest there. Looking at land use, again, beef is one of the highest land use requirements from a species standpoint, really leading from both a grazing standpoint, but also a need for arable land for feed. So think of all corn, soy, and other feed inputs that are going in there. Water use, again, something quite high for beef. No surprise that fish, and this researchers looked at both wild capture, but significantly more aquaculture studies. So farmed fish, obviously water is going to be a pretty significant requirement there. Eutrophication, again, something that from the standpoint of aquaculture using quite a lot of water, eutrophication impacts are quite high, as well as for cattle with some of the runoff. And then acidification of water bodies, again, quite high on the fish side. So overall, what this really sort of paints a picture of is that there's large environmental improvement by sourcing byproducts compared to human grade meat. And it was something that, was pretty clear and concise from what the researchers found across the research they reviewed. What we'll start talking about in a little bit later in the presentation is how those impacts actually interplay with some of those other areas for sustainability, such as, animal welfare, social impacts, but really in particular, the nutritional impact. So one of the areas that wasn't covered on an environmental side in here as well is that there is, some other areas that you could look at that other companies or NGOs have looked at when it comes to protein sourcing, which would be things like deforestation. That kind of gets to the land use component, but really from this side for the researchers, they tried to keep it focused to these couple areas. So looking at the social side, moving over to this, it's something where a lot of folks have seen what came out a couple of years ago around some of the shrimp processing facilities in Southeast Asia for forced labor violations. I think what a lot of folks missed in sort of the conversation around that and on a lot of the investigative journalist pieces is that a lot of the risks that were present in seafood processing for Southeast Asia that led to forced labor are actually present in almost any other industry. So there have been documented cases within U.S. fishing fleets operating out of Hawaii for forced labor. Child labor is pretty rampant in certain produce production facilities in areas sometimes like California or Florida. And so it's something where increasingly a lot of CEOs and companies are being held to account for their upstream supply chain impacts. And a lot of those companies still don't have a comprehensive understanding of their performance, where their risks are, and the sustainability impacts of that supply chain. So, cocoa is another great example where a lot of work is being done to eradicate child labor. And you're starting to see some pretty clear performance splits from some of the better operating companies and some that are continuing to struggle with it and or just are not seeing child labor as an issue for them to engage on. This is something that there is now U.S. legislation in place starting to mandate companies take action. So I think it's an important thing to note that there is a legislative risk here if an industry widely is not seen to be taking action. So when it comes to PET, let's look at sort of what some of those impacts might be. So right now, the U.S. Department of Labor updates twice yearly a list of goods that they have identified that are potentially coming from forced and or child labor. In order for them to say that a good is produced with either forced or child labor, they essentially have to have documented instances of that practice being in place on the ground in the country that's profiled. Looking at what some of the common ingredients are for pet food, from beef to carrots, corn, or looking at things like palm oil, rice, fish, there are 57 different ingredients that currently our U.S. Department of Labor says are coming from child labor, and there's 16 plus there that are coming from modern forms of slavery. So this isn't necessarily, a modern form of slavery. It could be something like debt bondage, where a supplier or producers withholding wages from field workers, or it could be something where they're withholding documents, not letting them leave. So there's different forms there. It's not necessarily a historical view of slavery, but can take a lot of different forms. And so if you think, hey, we might have some risk here or want to be doing the due diligence, what does that look like? So the first is to start having a traceable and transparent supply chain. The traceability piece is really knowing where items are coming from. So country of origin at a minimum, hopefully down to a little bit more of a regional or farm level. But then transparency is really focused more on what are the practices there on the ground. So, if there's a cattle producer or a produce supplier that's, providing a certain ingredient, what are their practices when it comes to child labor? Do they have a policy in place or document identification that they utilize in order to make sure that they're not hiring any workers under a certain age? And they're providing contractually established expectations. So this is really that kind of first line of defense for a brand or for a manufacturer. So this is something that a lot of folks kind of have in place as like a code of conduct or part of maybe a master purchasing agreement or a code of ethics. But it's something that if all of your suppliers, and if you're a manufacturer, all of your suppliers for sure, aren't signing up to some sort of minimum standard for your company when it comes to things like forced and or child labor, you're really potentially opening yourself up to a lot of undue risk, just from a standpoint of, if you can't point to here's our minimum standards of how we operate as a company, then you're very exposed when that next investigative AP story breaks on forced or child labor. It's also something that's increasingly being held to as a minimum for doing business in certain areas. So California has its Modern Transparency and Supply Chains Act. The UK and a number of other European Union countries have additional standards that are in place that are essentially just mandates for entry into the market there. And so this is something where a lot of companies are needing to spend a little bit of time to make sure that they have that in place. And then, obviously, once you have all that in place, you have to make sure you can monitor and evaluate it. So even if that's just doing kind of a supplier self-audit, collecting data annually, or even just cross-referencing that U.S. Department of Labor list with where you're sourcing from to see if there's any changes that have happened in the last 6 to 12 months, just making sure that you don't write a code of conduct and then it just sits there. That should be your minimum level of compliance, but then you should be continuing to evaluate against that code of conduct. And then lastly, with the corrective actions, this is something where it's really important, especially on the social side of things, that if you're able to uncover unacceptable practices or, sort of heaven forbid, the instances of really, significant neglect on the part of a producer around child labor or forced labor, a lot of companies, their initial indication is to immediately sever that partnership or that contract and walk away. What that ends up doing is it just drives those practices further underground, and all it really teaches is make sure that that supplier, that producer gets better at hiding things. So it's really important that before you walk away, which is an option you can do, but really before you walk away is to engage with that supplier and try and get corrective actions put in place and a plan agreed upon for them to improve. If that producer supplier is unwilling to do that, then it is something that you should really be looking to let somebody such as the Pet Sustainability Coalition know, who can treat all of this as sort of anonymously under an NDA, but they can act a little bit like a third-party clearinghouse. Because the example I want to walk through is in the garment side. So for apparel, there was a horrible factory collapse back in 2013. 1,100 people died from essentially the building collapsing due to really poor standards and sort of updating and operational compliance on the part of the producer. What happened was a lot of U.S. companies and European companies were using that factory for some of their apparel. All of them got together, said this isn't okay, we need to do a better job, and they started a much more robust auditing, monitoring, compliance framework. What happened a couple of years later was there was a horrible fire in Bangladesh, and at a garment factory, and pretty much all of the workers perished inside. And it was something where the manufacturer would lock the doors once workers started their shifts, so they had no way to leave. And so when a fire broke out, nobody unlocked those doors. And the horrible part here is a major U.S. apparel buyer had actually audited that factory a couple of weeks prior to the fire breaking out. That apparel manufacturer noted the unsafe conditions, and as a result of that, they pulled their purchasing from this manufacturer. They, however, did not report this to any other buyer, to any other third party, any NGO on the ground, or any government entity. And so what happened was unsafe conditions were identified, nobody was notified about it, and then 3 weeks later, those unsafe conditions led to a number of workers perishing because somebody wasn't able to share. So I would encourage all of you, especially on the social side, if you uncover practices, that are unsafe for workers, and obviously there's a lot of risk on the part of a brand in publicly disclosing that. Look for those sort of third-party actors, such as Pet Sustainability Coalition, that you could share this information with under sort of an NDA, that maybe then PSC could take the appropriate actions to make sure that instances like this don't happen again. So looking at nutrition. So this is something where oftentimes nutrition is not an area of focus for a lot of companies when it comes to sustainability. Certainly nutrition is a key component, though, of a sustainable food system. If we're not providing adequate, safe nutrition, then really nothing about our food system would be sustainable. So when we're looking at the impacts within the pet industry, looking at how to balance and support the overall sort of sustainability impacts and making sure that nutrition has a seat at the table there is a really important thing to look at. So with nutrition, certainly there's several factors there that can be influencing the overall nutritional sustainability, just from the standpoint of ingredient selection and nutrient composition to digestibility and then consumption rates. But sort of as we discussed earlier, that global food system could be considered nutritionally unsustainable for a multitude of reasons, just based off of the imbalance of how calories are distributed. When we're looking at, how this is impacting pets, it's something that we really have to look at from a standpoint of what are sort of the nutritional requirements and how best can we meet that, looking at the other aspects around, say, environmental impacts, social, as well as animal welfare. And, it's to say all of this is certainly a complex topic, I think compounded a lot by just a lack of data that's available, but also not great understanding of necessarily the linkages between all of these different aspects of sustainability. So this was one of the secondary areas that the ISU researchers were working to help us be able to better address. And so what they were looking at was the nutritional sustainability of protein sourcing and production. What they started to look at was, is there inferences or sort of conclusions that can be drawn around the nutritional impact of byproducts, and if the sort of improvements we saw from a standpoint of environmental benefits of byproducts, is that something that also potentially carries over on the nutritional side, or where are there gaps there? And this is something that I think is still ongoing from a review that sort of PSC has from an independent set of reviewers and panelists that are looking at the ISU research. Because what was pretty clear from the research and reviewing sort of the final report from ISU is that it certainly is a complex topic and something that at present there isn't a strong stance necessarily one way or the other that can be made, but PSC is looking at leading some additional research to help better answer this. And it's, a very important thing from a standpoint of looking at how sort of the changing consumer preferences, but also how our overall food system is starting to have to adapt to both changing preferences from the consumer and the market side, but also changing realities operationally on the ground on the environmental side. So this is something where, different things around that are impacting the sustainability of the pet food system, from nutritional issues, looking at things around, manufacturing and production and facilities and packaging, but it's also influenced heavily by those consumer perceptions and marketing efforts. So things in terms like, wild caught seafood or human grade ingredients are potentially problematic, as they tend to over prioritize one super specific aspect of sustainability at the expense of others. So it's a little bit of a misdirect from the overall sustainability impact and improvements we're trying to have with the food system. So that's where I think we really have the opportunity to be able to address these challenges a little bit more holistically through the product design, our ingredient sourcing and formulations and manufacturing processes, so that there's a more sustainable food system overall, both for pets, but also for humans. And then lastly, kind of looking at the fourth area here around animal welfare, this is something that is growing as both a consumer and stakeholder area of concern. How a lot of companies have started to approach this is looking at the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. So these are sort of broad guidelines developed about 60 years ago in the UK that really started to look at what are the basic rights that any animal should have, as far as what they're provided access to during their life. These are really nice introductory sort of terms and or phrases for animal welfare. They start to become a little harder to operationalize when you're looking at how do you incorporate these 5 freedoms into a purchase order for something like beef or chicken. And what we're starting to see is that in the absence of companies doing this a little bit more strategically, legislators and voters are actually doing this for them. So a number of states have passed animal welfare legislation that directly relates to protein sourcing. And so some of these, the simplest, are things like cage-free eggs. Others like California, Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts are actually mandating very specific standards for things like laying hens, but also for pigs, for sows, essentially making sure they have the minimum amount of space, veal calves, and you're starting to see more and more of this come on the legislative agenda. What is really interesting is with the new legislation that's coming forward, really led from California, there are now requirements being placed not just on a producer of the animal products, but the actual manufacturer. So starting January 1st next year, if you are manufacturing a product in California and you are sourcing eggs for that product, you are legally required to make sure those eggs are now cage-free. There will be similar requirements coming forward for Oregon, for Washington, for Massachusetts, and California will also be adding pork to the list of requirements in 2022, as well as for veal calves. And there's a number of other states that are following similar suit on this. So this is making it a little bit more complex if you are manufacturing something like pet food in the state of California, or importing some of it is something that right now that legislation wouldn't be requiring you to. So if you're importing it outside of the state, or if you're manufacturing it outside of the state and then importing it in, it won't have the same impact. But certainly if you have operations in California, it's something you'd be needing to pay attention to. And this is something that is really going to be continuing to increase. So there's a group, Open Philanthropy Project, that on their own is responsible right now for $52 million in funding to animal welfare NGOs in the last 2 years. A lot of this is for sort of campaigns targeting some of the restaurant and food service brands that are out there, and pushing those companies to make commitments around animal welfare. So the biggest push has been towards what they call a Better Chicken Commitment, which is sort of 4 main requirements around how chickens are sourced. And by and large, it's kind of difficult to quantify, but likely upwards of 30 to 40% of the market right now has committed to buying better chicken by 2025. A lot of these NGOs NGOs are continuing to focus on getting more and more commitments. And while they're generally focused on food service and hospitality, there is an indication that they will also starting to look at the pet industry. So it's something from a standpoint of minimum requirements around animal welfare. If it's not on your agenda right now, it certainly should be, given that there's over $50 million in funding that has gone out in the last 2 years, solely focused on how do companies become more engaged on this issue. It's also something that's being driven by investors. So there's an entity called the Business Benchmark for Farm Animal Welfare that they assess the year-to-year performance of, I think now it's almost 250 companies. The investors they represent have very deep pockets. So you're looking at 2.5 trillion that they have under management, and they continue to add a significant amount each year. And essentially, this is an involuntary assessment. So what the Business Benchmark does is it looks at what a company's commitments are around animal welfare, how they're talking about their progress, what that progress has been over the last 12 months, and then they assign them to one of 6 tiers. Increasingly, this is something that as they add more and more companies, they again are starting to look at what companies do they add after they've really captured the large market share for food service and hospitality. And I can tell you, pet is one of the industries that they have on their target for the coming years. So this is, again, something from a standpoint of animal welfare is just going to be on the agenda in a big way for a number of different stakeholders in the coming years. So walking through these 4, let's talk a little bit kind of about where we're going, how all these systems and different sustainability issues start to come together. Because I think what is clear is that there really is a need to improve the overall sustainability of protein sourcing. And so there's a couple potential sort of options that are on the table right now. I don't think there's any sort of silver bullet, but I think it's something that there's some pretty unique strategies that are underway. So we can walk through those, and then we'll open it up a little bit for Q&A. So one of the things that is of increasingly important for a lot of companies is just making sure we're utilizing the whole animal. So those sort of offcuts or non-traditional cuts can make up, depending on the animal, 10 to 25% of the market value there. And so that's a really big lever when you start looking at, you know, the food service and hospitality companies that are buying sort of the rest of the animal. 10 to 25% market values can be a significant lever to get producers to change for better environmental, social, or animal welfare practices. And you particularly see this with something like that Better Chicken initiative, where chefs, being who they are, pretty demanding, right now would be potentially buying breast from one bird, a wing from another bird, and a drumstick from yet another bird. So where all that meat might be raised, could be provided from one bird for a restaurant, there's actually 3 chickens that are needed because each of those cuts of meat is coming from a different producer, different supplier. What that means, though, is when you start to look for things around no antibiotics or offering environmental enrichments and better welfare practices, or things around like stocking density and growth rates, if a company is only buying the breast from that bird and the producer has to raise that bird according to those requirements just for that chicken breast that's being provided, that company that is mandating those requirements is going to take the entire price premium for those improvements just with that chicken breast. So this is something where what the market is seeing is that there's a significantly high cost when you break out sourcing this way. There's a huge opportunity here for pet to come in and align some of its buying and its asks with food service, with hospitality, and be a huge lever for change, because essentially you're looking at engaging that 10 to 25% of the animal that to date is not at all consideration when it comes to environmental, social, or animal welfare practices. Another area that is of increasingly coverage, but also importance, is looking at alternative proteins. So there's a number of things that are coming out from insect proteins, particularly looking at that from a contribution for feed, for things such as, aquaculture operations, but it's also something just as a protein source. There's a lot of opportunity there in the future. Obviously, cellular agriculture right now is prohibitively expensive. It continues to drop significantly each year. Likely from the folks in the companies I've been talking to, you're looking maybe around 10 years before that's fully commercially viable, but there's a lot of money, a lot of interest, and a lot of support going to it right now. So I think it's safe to say that, that will only continue to grow and have a bigger seat at the table. Invasive species, this is something where a couple sort of innovative, contracting options where folks have seen, particularly for things around aquaculture and or some of the, wild capture fisheries, where there's some opportunity to get invasive species out of an area by actually creating or incorporating them as a food source. The last one is sort of that whole animal utilization. So sort of looking at, where there's sort of practices that could be adopted that would help improve the sustainability. And then looking at how all of these come together, you sort of have these 4 quadrants. What you really want to be doing is sourcing somewhere right in the center. So something that, isn't going to be on the extremes on either side, but actually hitting right in the middle. Because what you will see if you look through sort of the industry as a whole is you might have things that are fair trade, so only focus on social, but they're way up there on the right. Or humane certified, so something for animal welfare, it's going to be all the way there on the left, but isn't necessarily taking into account larger environmental, social, or nutritional considerations. You can also have things such as byproducts, where, as we talked about earlier, there's a huge environmental benefit, but a lot of the other impacts are either not captured by only focusing on that, and or might actually have some negative connotations with it. Looking at things like human grade, where that's something, being more nutritious is an assumption, but that's why, it's an area of research that ISU and PSC are sort of diving into. But regardless of whether in human or pet food, consumers are looking for really sort of exceptional products that fulfill a purpose, offer better value propositions, and can connect on a personal level. And that's where some of these things like the invasive species, whole animal utilization, insect proteins, and cellular agriculture kind of land right there in the middle. There's some concerns around things, for cellular agriculture, and potentially even for insect proteins around things for the social. So, for cellular agriculture, what does it look like if you put a bunch of beef producers out of business? What does that sort of do for some of the rural communities that depend on that for their livelihoods? But I think from an overall standpoint, this is something that, there's very few options right now that directly sort of balance out these 4. And so these are some of the ones that are certainly emerging as new technologies or sort of practices that could continue to be adopted to help move some of this forward. So sort of kicking off sort of 3 questions for all of you to think about before we open it up to Q&A is just how could potentially you help optimize for several of these variables? So nutrition, environment, animal welfare, and social. Where can we potentially collaborate pre-competitively in our industry or out to improve sourcing? So is there the ability to potentially align some of the purchasing standards and specifications for social and animal welfare along with food service and hospitality companies? And then what tools, information, or resources would you need in order to be able to sort of really accomplish the first 2? What would you be looking for PSC to potentially help assist with, or where do you come into current challenges with your own operations? And so with that, please, if you have questions, remember to use sort of the chat function there. And Melissa, I'll sort of turn it over to you if any questions have come in during the presentation.
Yeah, Nick, first of all, great job. I find this content so fascinating, and I'm really excited for the Q&A, but I'm also really excited for the members only session where we're going to be talking about next steps and really setting some strategy. But we have had a lot of questions come in, and we've got I want to encourage everyone on the call that if you have questions to make sure you get those in the question box, and we'll get to them as many as we can. First of all, Nick, we've had several questions about the environmental impact slides near the beginning. So do you mind switching back to those, and then I'll let you know which questions we have. First of all, we have some questions about what was the light part of those graphs versus the dark. I think one was byproducts and one was human grade. So if you don't mind just touching on that again. And also some definitions around, can you explain what eutrophication and acidification are? We've got some confusion around that as well.
Okay. So the light shading, this is the human grade, and the darker shading is byproducts. So as an example here for beef, for GHG emissions, you'd be looking at the byproducts contribution is around 20 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of beef, whereas for the human grade, you're looking at something closer to 30, I think about 28 or so. And then for eutrophication, so this is essentially like a nutrient load of water that is discharged. So where that goes into water, what the impact there is that it starts to create those really big like algae blooms because there's excessive nutrients that get discharged into the water that aren't treated. And that can have a huge impact on aquatic ecosystems, essentially from a standpoint of creating those algae blooms, which then choke off a lot of the water that's available in those aquatic systems and make it really hard for all of the other species that are in there to survive. Whereas acidification is essentially the water quality that is being released. So this is looking at sulfur oxide equivalent. So how acidic is that water that's being discharged, or what are the impacts of that from a standpoint of the natural environment actually being able to buffer that out if it's not treated.
Okay, great. And Nick, we've got another question about these slides. For the sake of these slides and this conversation kind of in whole, do you mind just kind of quickly defining when we say byproduct in the context of this discussion, what are we talking about?
Yep. So byproducts, we'd be looking at these items right here on the right.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Can we have one question? David, thank you for the question. He asks, do you have any reflections on GAP, MSC, Certified Humane, and other certifications?
Yeah, so certifications are an interesting bag. I think there's a lot of them that are out there for animal welfare. So I think Global Animal Partnership, Certified Humane are both, really strong programs. I think one of the important things is look at sort of what you want to get out of your commitments for animal welfare. If you're looking for a logo you can put on product packaging, and that's really crucial, then I think those certification programs are worthwhile to look at. If you're just really wanting to ensure sort of a basic level of compliance, then you can look at just setting some standards outside of that, even building from some of the industry standards that are out there, like the National Chicken Council, or some of the United Egg Producers. There's different ones there that provide that sort of minimum floor. I would say, things like Certified Humane, Global Animal Partnership are really sort of the better of the certifications. There's also some really good ones out there around grass-fed for beef, as well as for bison. And then there is sort of a growing segment of other ones, but I would say those are the ones I would be looking at to date.
Perfect. Thank you. We've got lots and lots of questions coming in, so thank you for that. We have a question from Marty going back to those the graphs on the different environmental impacts of different proteins. How can a product have more environmental impact than meat? Is that because there is, hold on, let me rephrase this. How can a byproduct, excuse me, have more environmental impact than the meat itself? Is this because there is more byproduct in each animal?
So this isn't necessarily from the relative percentage. This is looking at the per kilogram of product. So per kilogram of byproduct or per kilogram of human grade meat, what the contribution is. These charts would look different if you were to pull it out for the entire animal, because obviously, a cow is going to weigh more than just 1 kilogram. So when that gets extrapolated out, it would look quite different.
Oh, that makes sense. Great. Thanks, Nick. All right, we've got a really, really great question coming in from Tiffany. So thank you for the question, Tiffany. The question is this: our industry, in comparison to the human food industry, is held to such different labeling standards. Since many byproducts are not allowed to be specifically named on an ingredient deck, it seems our restrictions in labeling have encouraged less use of certain nutrient-rich byproducts. Is there a way to work with AAFCO on changing this?
It's a great question. I certainly hope there would be a way to sort of work on that as far as what the pathway for that would be. I think that's something that I would have to talk to some others on the best way to position that. I think this is something where the conversation around environmental impact and nutritional availability of some of these ingredients, there's a need for better data. And I think as we get that better data, it can certainly help inform that conversation.
Great. We've got another great question come in. Nick, how does the growing demand for organic foods and ingredients affect sustainability and this conversation moving forward?
Yeah, so organic is interesting from it's just such a small percentage of our overall food production system. And you have the potential where organic in and of itself is not necessarily sustainable. I have walked some pretty large produce operations that are organic that I would not call sustainable. I think what organic really has the ability to do, though, is to shift current practices. So a lot of what organic farmers use as far as their practices for things like produce, but also for livestock and for animals, is it changes their management practices of those animals. And it's something that, to a certain extent, it decreases your reliance on artificial inputs, whether those are pesticides or fertilizers, or antibiotics or other things, and it actually makes you look at everything a little bit more holistically. So I think organic has a huge role to play from a standpoint of encouraging better practices and being something to look to learn from. I think we're going to run into issues scaling organic, at least sort of the certified organic, as fast as we need some of these improvements to take place. So I would encourage organic to be something folks look at, but don't look at it as, what you have to hit. I think you can start making improvements that are really going to provide a lot of benefits for everybody before you would ever hit a level where it could be certified organic.
Yeah, also let me do a quick plug. So for our members who were able to join us at our yearly member summit, Impact Unleashed, back in October, we had a great talk from Kashi that she came in and talked about their process in supporting farmers and growers and producers in the organic journey. One of the main problems that that industry is having is that it requires several years to transition to organic, and there isn't a market for those basically organic materials, but not being allowed to be called that in the transition years. And so the industry and association that is working in that space, helping farmers make that transition and helping producers make that tradition, and trying to find markets for those those products in the years. That will be our actual webinar in February, and talking about how brands and producers can get engaged into that conversation. So we hope you will join us in our webinar in February. So we have a lot of questions that I think we're about against time. So I will say that even if we weren't able to get to your questions, both myself, PSC, and Nick will also be available to answer your questions by email. So please feel free to follow up with us. Nick, do you mind jumping to the end? So we're going to talk, so we can talk about kind of what's coming up.
Certainly. And please, if you do have questions, continue to submit, and we'll make sure we get a response back to you on it.
Absolutely. So a couple of exciting things coming up. First of all, directly after this conversation, in just a few minutes, we're going to end this webinar, and then we're going to restart on the members only session. So if we have any PSC members that are part of this call that aren't registered for the second session, please drop me an email and let's make sure we get you a part of this conversation. We're going to be talking about PSC's involvement of next steps, how PSC members can be involved and such. So we want to get everybody involved in that conversation. If you aren't a PSC member, please also feel free to drop me an email. We'd love to talk to you about PSC membership and the benefits that we can be for your specific company, helping drive social and environmental good while also driving business value. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we do this webinar series almost monthly. We're going to take next month off in observation of the holidays and, Q4 insanity, but we'll start back up in January with a really exciting webinar talking about plastic neutral and using the carbon offsets model on plastic. So not just packaging, but plastic materials. And could we use the carbon offsetting methodology and apply it to plastic? And there's companies that are getting started in this space, and what does that look like, and what does that mean for brands and producers moving forward? So we hope you will join us in January for that conversation. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We will get started on that PSC member conversation in just a few minutes under the different link, so please join us for that. And Nick, thank you so much. This presentation has been amazing. I hope it continues in the PSC member session immediately after, but also over email or phone for anybody that has some further questions. So thanks so much for joining us, and thank you, Nick.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your week.